Throughout the history of paleontology, there have been few debates as long-running and potentially heated as those involving the tyrant lizard king. Amongst this discourse, one debate stood above many in a class all its own. In the final days of the Mesozoic, did Tyrannosaurus reign over its North American domain alone as the last and greatest of the tyrannosaurs? Or did another enigmatic heir to the tyrant reptile legacy stand short in its own way? Nanotyrannus was a name that once invited chaos and sparked division at the mere mention of it for decades, but it might now go down in history in a whole different way. So, how did we get to this point? A point at which, right before Halloween 2025, a seemingly long-buried genus of dinosaur came clawing its way out of its taxonomic grave. I know I've said countless times in my other videos that I don't really ever want to touch the Rex v Nano debate, but now is the perfect time to, considering what has been discovered. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell icon. Welcome to the guild. Part 1. Leave while you can. Tiny Tyrant among us? To figure out the mystery currently unfolding in front of our eyes, we must first take a trip back in time. Not to the Cretaceous, my friends, but just back 83 years, and to the Badlands of Carter County, Montana. During a 1942 expedition to further explore the late Cretaceous geologic formation known as the Lance Formation, on behalf of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, paleontologist and fish guy David Dunkel discovered a peculiar, almost 2-foot-long skull of a carnivorous theropod dinosaur eroding from what they used to call the Hell Creek member of the Lance Formation, but what is now considered the full Hell Creek Formation. Dunkel would go on to be honored with the name of the giant placoderm Dunkelosteus, just FYI. This theropod skull would be described in a 1946 Smithsonian published paper by Charles Gilmore as a new species of the then already known genus Gorgosaurus, specifically naming it Gorgosaurus lancensis, with the species name in reference to the now incorrect assignment of the skull to the Lance Formation. that would pretty much be it for this thing, with only experts knowing about it for the following 42 years. In August 1988, the specimen was redescribed by a trio of paleontologists that many from the 90s and 2000s would no doubt recognize. Robert Bacher, Michael Williams, and Phil Curry published a paper in the now-defunct Hunteria Societas Paleontographica Coloradensis journal, taking a more in-depth look at that old skull described in 1946, housed at the Cleveland Museum. Interestingly, they also took a look at an assortment of strange, blade-like teeth that had been found in 1924 in the same geologic formation as the Gorgosaurus lancensis skull that were then accessioned in the collections of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. These teeth were found alongside those definitively belonging to a small Tyrannosaurus. Specimen CMNH 7541 seemed to retain many traits that separated it not only from Gorgosaurus, but all other tyrannosaurs known at the time, and therefore needed to be upgraded to genus level. The team rebranded it as Nanotyrannus lancensis, the dwarf tyrant of the lance. Nanotyrannus seemed to contain a combination of primitive and advanced anatomy. Bits and pieces seen in earlier forms, as well as bits seen in more evolutionarily advanced forms, such as Tyrannosaurus. One was that the snout was 1/4 the width of the back end of the skull. This feature is only seen in as extreme a way in Tyrannosaurus. An odd and broad feature that sets it apart from the advanced tyrannosaurs, and is more similar to forms like Alioramus, is that its snout is definitely much less robust than forms belonging to the Tyrannosauridae family. The teeth of this proposed Nanotyrannus are much more flat, side to side, than the rounded railroad spike teeth of the Tyrannosaurids. One of the anatomical features that set it apart from most other tyrannosaurs was the lack of strong ridges, striae, and rugosities along the top of the skull. The slim-snouted Mongolian Alioramus is famous for having 5 to 6 hornlets along the snout, and Tyrannosaurus had chunky rugose crests around the eye socket. Nanotyrannus does have a little bit of waviness going on along the nasal bones, and does have some pointy bits on the lacrimal bones, but they don't really resemble the same bone texture in other tyrannosaurs. Nanotyrannus also has a neck configuration and binocular field of view most similar to Tyrannosaurus, so it offered some interesting implications for the evolution of these animals. However, due to such a hodgepodge of features, including ones not seen across the entire Tyrannosaurian group, the 1988 paper considered most of the similarities to the advanced members of the Tyrannosauridae a result of convergent evolution, when two distantly related lineages evolved similar structures. Nanotyrannus largely went under the radar for a good portion of the 1990s until the end of the decade and start of the 21st century, when a few scientists decided to take a different approach to Nanotyrannus. Journey to Synonymy. Thomas Carr is a vertebrate paleontologist renowned for being one of the world's few tyrannosaur experts. I mean, there's probably a lot if you include people that work on other animals as well as tyrannosaurs, but the most well-known are usually Phil Curry, Dave Hone, Thomas Holtz, Pete Larsson, and somehow Jack Horner. In 1999, Carr published a paper in which he hypothesized that Nanotyrannus was not a valid genus or species, and instead represented the juvenile form of Tyrannosaurus rex. I will go into more detail about this major point in tyrannosaur research really soon, but a lot of people don't know that Carr wasn't the first to come up with this idea. Rozhdestvensky, 1965. Anatoly Rozhdestvensky, a Soviet paleontologist active during the first half of the 20th century, was the guy responsible for reanalyzing the many tyrannosaur specimens known from Mongolia, resulting in the name Tarbosaurus. Let me backtrack real quick on you. The Asian cousin to Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, was originally discovered in the late 1940s and described in the mid-1950s by Evgeny Malayev, also the guy who described Therizinosaurus as a turtle, just FYI. He considered it so similar to Tyrannosaurus that he named it as a new species to this old genus, Tyrannosaurus batar. At the same time he made this name and defined it, he also came up with Tarbosaurus ephremovi, Gorgosaurus lancinator, and Gorgosaurus novogelovi. Decades later, Rozhdestvensky came back to these specimens and found that they did not contain enough differences to validate their existence, and so he synonymized them all together, resulting in the combination of Tarbosaurus batar. In this 1965 paper, Rozhdestvensky noted a few similarities and differences between the juvenile and adult Tyrannosaurus specimens he was combining into one species, and then made the same comparison between Tyrannosaurus and what was then Gorgosaurus lancensis. As Rozhdestvensky puts it, this would mean it's possible that Gorgosaurus lancensis is actually the juvenile form of Tyrannosaurus rex. This is then the basis upon which Thomas Carr begins his 1999 paper, furthering the case that these two dinosaurs, now having two unique labels, are actually one and the same. Carr, 1999. 1999 saw Thomas Carr publish a paper in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, in which he takes a look at a bunch of Albertosaurus skeletons of different growth stages, the Cleveland Museum skull holotype of Nanotyrannus, and the growth stages of Tarbosaurus, in order to find out what the hell was going on. Carr found that Albertosaurus morphs from a slender juvenile with immature bone texture and very long legs with roughly similar tibia to femur lengths into a robust adult with rugosities all over the skull and a longer femur. Obviously, the Nanotyrannus holotype is just a noggin, so Carr could only compare the skull bones to those of younger Albertosaurs. He noted that the arrangement and anatomy of the individual skull bones, lack of fusion in some of those bones, the gracilness of the bones, and the larger number of teeth all meant that the Nanotyrannus skull was a juvenile and fairly normal in development for juveniles of more advanced tyrannosaurs, like Albertosaurus and Tarbosaurus, both of which come from two major sides of the Tyrannosaur tree, the Albertosaurines and the Tyrannosaurines, as part of the Tyrannosauridae. One seemingly insignificant trait here is the tooth count. Carr found that young Albertosaurs had more teeth than adults. His hypothesis was that the skull bones changed so drastically as the animal aged that the tooth count could shift as proportionally larger teeth crowded out some smaller tooth sockets. Keep this in mind as I move forward. Jane, 2001. Carol Tuck and Bill Harrison, while on an expedition to the Hell Creek Formation of Appalachia, Montana, with the Burpee Museum of Rockford, Illinois, led by Michael Henderson, discovered the remains of a small tyrannosaur of some type eroding from an outcrop. Once it was brought back to the museum and prepared, researchers knew it was something incredibly special. Though far from complete, this small tyrannosaur preserved enough of its skeleton, and more importantly, its skull, to immediately bring up comparisons to the Nanotyrannus skull that had been sitting around without a new label the preceding 13 years. Specimen BMRP 2002.4.1, aka Jane, prompted a conference to be held at the Burpee Museum of Natural History in 2005, inviting every Tyrannosaur expert in the US to weigh in on what the hell this thing was. Part 2. Leave while you're ahead. Conflict arises. Burpee Conference 2005. Due to the weirdness of Jane, a conference was held at the Burpee Museum of Illinois in 2005. However, it wasn't all to do with Jane, Nanotyrannus, or the Rex v Nano debate. As J. Michael Parrish and Ralph Molnar write up in a 2013 compilation of many of the talks given at the 2005 conference, quote, "Of the 30 presentations given, 8 concentrated on Tyrannosaur ontogeny, 21 on other aspects of Tyrannosaur paleobiology, and 1 each about dating, Jane, and about Barnum Brown." End quote. The vibe coming out of this conference was that Jane was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, and that this likely meant that Nanotyrannus was no longer a valid genus. Some preliminary work on the internal anatomy of Jane's bone structure, plus the fact that it sports some lack of fusion in the bones, and general immature traits seen in known juvenile specimens of Tyrannosaurus, all proved early on that the Jane specimen was indeed a juvenile animal. Comparing the size and age-related traits of Jane to estimates of Tyrannosaurus growth rates also seemed to indicate that Jane was at the right size and age to have died shortly before reaching a massive growth spurt. This was taken as further proof that Jane was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, as it would have needed to take on this growth spurt to start to change into something more like an adult Tyrannosaurus. That said, a paper by Pete Larsson in the 2013 Tyrannosaurid Paleobiology book that resulted from the 2005 Burpee conference found that certain parts of Jane's skeleton actually had fused. For example, Larsson found the scapulocoracoid or shoulder girdle, pelvis, and the center and dorsal spines of the vertebrae throughout the spine had all fused or almost fused. Larsson also brought up the tooth count issue, with Jane and the Cleveland skull sporting 15 or 16 tooth positions in the upper jaw, with all known adult Tyrannosaurus specimens containing 11 or 12 positions. The same issue is reflected in the lower jaw or dentary bones. Jane and Cleveland have 17 tooth positions, and Tyrannosauruses all have 13 or 14. Another weird thing is that the teeth in the very tip of the jaw, a bone called the premaxilla, aren't serrated, but those same teeth are serrated in Tyrannosaurus. The bigger issue in the early 2000s really just was that there were only 2 purported specimens of Nanotyrannus, and they're both not fully mature. In order to get a good handle on all this, one way or another, you'd need a lot more and of different ages and sizes to better smooth out the gaps. A definitively adult Nanotyrannus, or a juvenile Tyrannosaurus that clearly wasn't a nano, would have settled the debate pretty definitively. While several specimens were proposed to be juvenile Tyrannosaurus, there was a lot of ambiguity as to their identity, and some argued that they were nanospecimens or separate genera or species in their own right. LACM 23845 Dinotyrannus megagracilis. All the way back in 1967, while paleontologist Harley Garbani was uncovering the skull and fragmentary postcranial remains of an adult Tyrannosaurus from the Hell Creek Formation at the L.D. Engdahl Ranch in Garfield County, Montana, and that would go on to have the specimen number LACM 23844 and nickname Harley, his team from the LA County Museum found another Tyrannosaur in the scrap piles made by a bulldozer moving overburden away. This rather fragmentary second specimen would turn out to be relatively immature, as it was quite a bit smaller than most adult tyrannosaurs, either at the time of discovery or even as far forward as 2001 and 2005 with the Jane Conference. The second Tyrannosaur, LACM 23845, consists of a skull that includes the right maxilla, right lacrimal, the frontals, nasals, parietals, dentaries, right coronoid, and right syringular bones. The rest of it subsists of the right scapula and coracoid, or shoulder girdle, the right ulna, both ischia of the pelvis, the right femur, tibia, and astragalus, a nearly complete right foot, and 2 phalanges from the left foot. Not bad, but also not amazing. This thing was always considered an immature tyrannosaur. It was just always unclear how specifically one could identify it. In 1980, Ralph Molnar referred the specimen to Albertosaurus lancensis, a temporary name given to Gorgosaurus lancensis since Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus had been lumped together for a time. Then the enigmatic artist and sometimes researcher Greg Paul published on the specimen in 1988, renaming the species label to Albertosaurus megagracilis. George Olszewski then did some more work on this thing in 1995, upgrading the genus label to a new one, Dinotyrannus megagracilis. This analysis found LACM 23845 closely related to Nanotyrannus. In 2000, Oliver Rauhat did some more investigation of all this stuff and found that technically, the species identification was kinda mediocre. Greg Paul hadn't illustrated the specimen, provided incorrect references, and gave no actual formal list of diagnosis for this species. So, sadly, Megagracilis would fall under the nomen nudum label, a naked name. Eventually, the specimen would be subsumed into the Tyrannosaurus rex species, just like Nanotyrannus. However, it represents something different still, as it is larger than the Cleveland skull and Jane. Despite this, it wouldn't play much of a role in any future discussions on Nanotyrannus validity. It would be placed in some growth rate graphs since it was lumped into T-Rex, so it stood in the place of the growth changes between Jane and smaller adult specimens. That 2005 Burpee conference seemed to tentatively validate the idea that Nanotyrannus was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus. Some nanotoothers, like Phil Curry and Michael Williams, were convinced due to the work of Carr and others, plus the lack of other specimens and the more or less definitive immaturity of the two known specimens. Sure, Larsson would find a whole list of reasons as to why Jane wasn't really young enough to fit the growth curve for Tyrannosaurus, but many other justifications against this would sort of drown it out in greater discussions. Growth rate studies would use the Cleveland skull, Jane, and LACM 23845 to great effect, finding that Tyrannosaurus had moderate growth for the first couple years of life before getting as large as Jane, slowing down a little bit, before hitting a huge growth spurt into the LACM 23845 size and then the adult size we all know and love. Still, detractors were not fully convinced, and some researchers, like Nicholas Longrich and Thomas Holtz, remained open to the possibility that Nanotyrannus was valid even if there wasn't really any definitive word on it. The consensus increasingly favored the hypothesis that Nanotyrannus was indeed just a synonym for underdeveloped, long-legged teen rexes before they hit their major growth spurt. This led to numerous studies using these juvenile nanospecimens as juvenile Tyrannosaurus when trying to understand growth rate, skull remodeling, paleobiology, and paleoecology. It also led to speculations that the various ecosystems present in geologic formations, such as the Lance and Hell Creek, operated very differently than modern ecosystems. Juvenile rexes were mesopredators. In most modern ecosystems, there is a size gradient in both herbivores and carnivores. If one were to look at Yellowstone National Park, for instance, one would find herbivores of all size classes, from rodents to bison to moose. There is a smooth gradient in body size with many different animals filling in the spots from micro to small to adequate to medium large to giant. The same goes for carnivores, with shrews to weasels to foxes, bobcats, coyotes, wolves, cougars, and bears. Even with the missing Ice Age megafauna, there is still an equal body size gradient in both animal guilds, and many of the species in each size class occupy a range of niches that often overlap. The ecosystems in the Hell Creek and Lance formations seem to be kinda messed up. The herbivores were the less messed up, as they seemed to obey the same size gradient as the Yellowstone exemplar. You've got small pachycephalosaurs, like Spheratholus, a little smaller than a coyote. This increases to Leptoceratops, Tethesallosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Denversaurus, Ankylosaurus, Triceratops and Torosaurus, and finally with Edmontosaurus as the largest known herbivore. The weird part is that the carnivore guilds for these formations did not work this way and did not match the Yellowstone exemplar, and for further context, the Yellowstone thing is seen in many other ecosystems globally. Instead, Hell Creek and Lance showed a distinct lack of mesopredators, or carnivores occupying the size niche between small critters and big guys. Gyaracuncus is the smallest, and an insectivore. You have the dromaeosaurs, Echiraptor, and Pectinodon, and that's pretty much it. There were oviraptorosaurs, such as Anzu and Eoneophron, plus the ornithomimosaurs, Ornithomimus, and Struthiomimus. However, these four theropod dinosaurs are sort of ecologically ambiguous. They may be omnivorous, but exactly how carnivorous or herbivorous they were remains a subject of debate. I think they can count since their claws and jaws look adapted for snagging and chomping on small prey items, but regardless, they don't really count as pure carnivores nor as pure predators. The only thing that does, or did, is Dakotaraptor, which was between Deinonychus and Utahraptor in size, assuming it's valid. Dakotaraptor has way more issues with it than even Nanotyrannus, so for all intents and purposes it doesn't count. Not yet anyways. Plus, some of these critters are extremely new, so the lack of mesopredators was an even bigger issue in the 2000s and early 2010s, when this was used in the Rex v Nano debate. Now, this issue can also be seen in other Mesozoic geologic formations. One possible answer as to why this happens is preservational bias. In other words, the fossil record has a hard time preserving everything. Big, heavy bones can survive longer before becoming buried and turned to mineral through fossilization. Smaller things are more fragile and are more easily torn apart. The other issue is sampling bias, aka not enough people are out there in enough places searching for fossils. Some geologic formations get more attention and resources than others. The Hell Creek Formation is one of these overly advantaged layers, due to slipping a Tyrannosaurus out every now and then. So it would make sense that, let's say, the Cloverleaf Formation of early Cretaceous Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah would have those ecological size gaps in known fossil animals. The Hell Creek, in comparison, has 10 or more times the attention and still has this weird gap. I don't know, sort of makes one think there is more of a preservational bias going on than solely a sampling bias, right? Alright, so how does this get solved with Hell Creek? One hypothesis that became the consensus for many years, from the 2000s to the 2010s, was that both Hell Creek and Tyrannosaurus were extremely bizarre. The reasoning is that ecosystems of the past might just have been entirely different, or at least super unique compared to those with us today. Why were there no mesopredators in the most heavily worked geologic formation on Earth? Tyrannosaurus was the mesopredator. The Nanotyrannus specimens, now understood to be Juvenile Tyrannosaurus, would occupy the ecological size niche of the mesopredator, having muscled out any native competition there may have been when the Tyrannosaurus genus or its ancestors migrated into North America from Asia. Though that funny jaw from New Mexico might mean these big beasties had been around the whole time, left to Asia only to come back to North America. A toxic relationship if I've ever seen one. This was first proposed by Thomas Holtz in a 2008 paper in the compendium Tyrannosaurus the Tyrant King, which was the first of 2 books to come out of the 2005 Burpee Nanotyrannus conference. He noted the possibility that juvenile Tyrannosaurus occupied a different ecological niche to the adults due to the dramatic difference in skeletal anatomy. This was carried forward in a 2010 science paper by Steve Brusati and crew, eventually getting a new term: Ontogenetic niche partitioning. Well, alright, problem solved, right? That seems to make more sense, right? These juvenile Tyrannosaurs had skinnier blade-like teeth and longer legs for going after smaller prey, and then morphed into the giant adult Tyrannosaurus with bone-pulverizing teeth for use against the really big prey animals. Many papers even put up the modern American alligator as an example of this sort of ontogenetic niche partitioning, not only occurring in nature, but in the Archosaur group too. Well, as it would turn out, this actually makes less sense the longer you think about it. No modern ecosystem and their animal guilds work this way. Even with our modern ecologically impoverished ecosystems, there is still so much diversity and overlap in ecological niche that no juvenile acts as its own unique species in the ecosystem. I can see where experts were coming from though. Dinosaurs were super weird compared to mammals, even though you can cherry pick some as possibly having mammalian growth curves or physiologies. The alligator example is sort of in a gray area because it is true that their young occupy a different spot in the ecosystem, but they don't muscle out adult forms of species that are the same size as them. In fact, they are prey for animals even only slightly larger than themselves. The little gatorlings have a weak as heck bite compared to their mammas and pappas. A catfish only 5 inches longer than a baby gator will try to swallow it. The baby gators also only eat things that can fit in their mouths and down their throats. They cannot and do not attack and kill prey as large or larger than themselves, as their death roll is not as deathy or rolly as an adult. They go after tadpoles, small fish, big bugs, rodents, and that sort of stuff. So, though their diet definitely shifts as they age, and though they definitely fit into a different ecological slot as they age, they do not act as a separate species as a baby. So this could very well apply to juvenile Tyrannosaurus, whatever they end up looking like. However, since Tyrannosaurus is a predator and would be far rarer in the ecosystem than herbivores, once a juvenile ages up into an adult, there would be a void in the ecosystem that would otherwise be hypothetically filled by medium-sized mesopredators. In other words, though there is truth to the idea that a juvenile Tyrannosaurus would occupy a different ecological niche to its parent, assuming it did not live with and hunt with its parents for a very long period of time, there would still need to be mesopredators to fill in the same role in the ecosystem as these juvenile Tyrannosauruses aged out of this ecological niche and took on the roles of other adults. It's simply not a good argument for the synonymy of Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus. That said, maybe I'm making it out to be a bigger talking point than it ever truly was. It was certainly something many experts talked about, and it did get its own special hypothesis name, ontogenetic niche partitioning, but it was only one of many talking points regarding the Nano v Rex debate.
Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Takanobu Tsuhiji and a group of other dinosaur experts published a paper in the journal Vertebrate Paleontology in 2011. Covering the growth changes seen in the Asian Tyrannosaur Tarbosaurus. This paper provided both pros and cons to the Nano v Rex debate. The paper described the skeleton of a juvenile Tyrannosaur that had then been discovered in Mongolia in 2006. They found that the specimen had all the hallmarks of a juvenile Tarbosaurus and was from the right time and place. The specimen was, and may technically still be, one of the ontogenetically youngest Tyrannosaurs known from the most complete remains. The study found that the diet of juvenile Tyrannosaurs may have shifted as the animals aged, since the skull was not as strong and the body proportions meant they were faster and nimbler than their adults. However, they also found that tooth count did not change from juvenile to adult, but were only different between individuals, meaning that any major tooth difference would indicate a difference in species or some wacky genetic thing going on amongst individuals of a species. This is a major stick in the Nano v Rex debate's craw, as it will keep coming up as one of the major points of contention. However, before it becomes super relevant, there is yet another paper and anatomical piece of information we need to consider. Larsson 2013. Pete Larsson, Tyrannosaur expert and dirty capitalist, published a paper in the Tyrannosaurid Paleobiology book in 2013, the book that was a result of the 2005 Burpee conference on Jane, but almost a decade late to print. He then presented on this very paper as a poster at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference. In both, he argues for the validity of Nanotyrannus. He notes that the fusion of many of the bones throughout the spinal column, shoulders, and pelvis indicate that Jane was near adulthood when it died, contrary to the unfused nature of some of its other bones. He also argues that all known relevant Nanotyrannus specimens have more teeth in their upper and lower jaws, that those teeth are different in anatomy, that there is a unique exit hole for the major nerve that runs through the upper jaw, unique holes in the skull through which air sacs would have passed, a shallowness to the large indentation present in the upper jawbone called an antorbital fossa, this long groove going along the jaw here, a wishbone that looks different to the one in Tyrannosaurus, an outward-facing shoulder socket. As he states, quote, a proportionally and absolutely larger manus, end quote, or hand. A hand that has actual finger bones in the third finger, even though this third finger is still reduced and nearly vestigial. And finally, a hooked form of part of the pelvis that points forward. That seems like a lot. Do you think he stopped to breathe while writing all that? I just stopped to breathe more than a few times, but I edited those out because I hate the way they sound in my little earbuds. Editing ASMR might kill me. The reason some of these Nanotyrannus specimens seem to fit the mold, as it were, of the growth series of Tyrannosaurs and Tyrannosaurus itself, as Pete argues and cites John Horam as arguing as far back as 2005, is that contentious specimens were used as juvenile Tyrannosaurs in the growth chart data. Compared to other Tyrannosaurs like Tarbosaurus, some things seemed strange with Tyrannosaurus growth. The only way forward would be if new specimens were described, and just such a breakthrough was finally made in 2025. But there's a good bit of tyrannical lore between 2011 and 2025 that I think bears mentioning. Hey, mind if I just butt in real quick? Just throwing out a little reminder to subscribe and like this video. Share it around as much as you can. The more eyes, the better. Part 3. No, really, why are you still here? Dueling Dinosaurs. I've talked about Montana's Dueling Dinosaurs twice before. I've tried to stay away from anything Nanotyrannus due to the 4,000 words I just wrote and then spoke to you. Lots of back and forth, lots of interesting tidbits of info gleaned from the nearly eradicated corpses of long-dead dragons, and maybe just a teensy bit of ego. You should go check out those 2 other Nanotyrannus videos for fuller context regarding the Montana Dueling Dinos specimen. If you really want me to make a dedicated video to this specimen as opposed to those shorter, older, news-related videos, just make sure to bug the shit out of me. Like, seriously, I need you to goad me into something like that. I won't leave you hanging here though. The Montana Dueling Dinosaurs is a specimen of a Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus seemingly locked together. Both the Triceratops and Tyrannosaur are remarkably complete, with the Tyrannosaur a small, seemingly immature animal. The specimen was found in 2006 by Clayton Phipps, Mark Eatman, and Chad O'Connor on private ranch land owned by the Severson and Murray families in the Montana Badlands. The specimen remained unknown to the greater paleoenthusiast circles and the public, probably because the crew had to field prepare, jacket, and take the whole thing to a building to then painstakingly prepare as much as they felt was needed until 2011, at which time Phipps and Pete Larsson launched a website and a campaign to get this thing sold to the highest bidder, ever the budding capitalists they are. Of course, they would love to see it go to a public institution, but if a private outfit were to swoop in and provide the millions they initially asked for, they would get it, and no one would be the wiser. To be fair to these guys, they tried to sell it first to the Smithsonian and Museum of the Rockies, with no luck. It was then that the specimen was going to go to some private collectors when Pete Larsson tried to do something a little wacky. He made a presentation and public plea to any potential buyers in the public and publicly connected part of the private sector at the 2013 Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference, but to no avail. Several years and no buyers later, Lindsay Zano of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences came to start negotiative talks with the guys circa 2016. That's when even more controversy struck this already bloated mess. It deserves a film. Maybe it's not as crazy as the Sioux debacle, but it's still pretty dramatic. Zano wanted to get some of the millionaire and billionaire museum donors to band together to get this specimen, but it turned out that the 2 families who owned the land it was found on decided only then to start arguing with one another about who actually owns the specimen. No doubt from hearing the price tag numbers under negotiation. I mean, I don't really blame them, as I would want a cut of it too. That said, I'm probably much less well off than any random rancher, so, 6, 7, or half a dozen of the other, really. One family argued they owned the fossils because the fossils are made of minerals and they had the mineral rights to the land, while the other family said that the fossils aren't the same thing as mineral resources despite being made of minerals, and so they don't count as part of the mineral rights laws. One court case had ruled in favor of the Murrays, and then a 2018 court case ruled in favor of the Seversons, only to flip again back to the Murrays due to a 2020 appeal. This has much broader implications for the private and academic collection of fossils nationwide, but I don't need to get into that here. Suffice it to say, we got the good ending. The Murrays got the specimen, and the Murrays and Clayton Phipps and co. sold the damn thing to Zano's museum, finally accessioning the things as of 2020. The next several years saw the museum construct a new wing to act as a live, open-air fossil preparation lab, to both display the dueling dinos and show people how science is done directly, pick by pick. The state-of-the-art facility completed their work and published the first of many papers on the Tyrannosaur half of the specimen in 2025 in the journal Nature. Woodward et al. 2020. But before I get to the meat of the debate and the reason you're here, I want to edge science you a little bit. Like I keep whining about, there's a lot of paperwork with this topic. One of those pieces of paperwork was published in 2020 in Science Advances by Holly Woodward and a big old team of boners. Boner experts. Bone scientists.
Oh, you know the thing.
In order to prove what the hell was going on with Jane and a second very fragmentary specimen called PT and labeled as BMRP 2006.4.4, they needed to go inside the bone. Really cut some hefty slices of that stuff. With some thin slices, they could tell roughly how old the dinosaurs were when they kicked the bucket. That seemed to matter here because if Jane was an adult, that would mean that it couldn't possibly be a juvenile Tyrannosaurus. If it turned out to be a juvenile, that would still leave some wiggle room. It could be a juvenile Tyrannosaurus or a juvenile of an unknown Tyrannosaur. So this team sliced up some bones, mounted those slices on microscope slides, and placed them under the microscope and under several different wavelengths of light. This technique found that Jane was around 13 at death and PT was around 15 years old. However, due to a lack of things called cyclical growth marks, the ages at death were minimums and they may have been older. The researchers found that these critters were growing at similar rates to birds and mammals and that they had not entirely ceased growing. Boy, were they wrong. They were right, but also wrong. Everything will become clear to you. Longrich and Saita, 2024. Some individuals pressured SciCommers to ignore this study when it came out due to those involved in the study, but now that some of its results have been partially vindicated and since I'm taking the time to cover the entire Nanovyrex saga, I figured it feels more relevant. Nicholas Longrich and Evan Saita published a paper on the Nanovyrex debate in 2024, arguing that there are multiple lines of evidence that prove Nanotyrannus is a valid genus. This was before the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen was published, so this team had to work with less data. To conduct their grisly business, the two scientists did a cluster analysis. This means that they put a bunch of Tyrannosaurus and purported Nanotyrannus specimens into a tree-like diagram called a dendrogram that groups similar data points together based on traits they do or do not share. In this case, they used 158 traits the two could possibly have and let the software do some of the computing. Longrich and Saita also did some histology, the study of microscopic tissues and soft or hard tissues observed by thin sectioning those tissues, mounting them on microscope slides, and looking at the anatomy under the scope and with different wavelengths of light. Unfortunately, this team doesn't seem to have actually done any actual histologic sampling themselves. Fortunately, that's not inherently incorrect, and here this means they took data from sections made of appropriate bones from FNMH PR 2081, or SU, BMRP 2006.4.4, or PT, BMRP 2002.4.1, or Jane, and SWAU HRS 081514, or Zuri, from various scientific papers published in the past. Why bother making new histologic samples of these precious specimens when they've already been made? Unless we're to find something wrong with a given sample, of course. Next, the two also did an actual phylogenetic analysis using the PAUP software and two matrices of a bunch of Tyrannosaur data that had already been published. Into these matrices, they put a composite Nanotyrannus, which mishes the anatomical information from Jane, the Cleveland skull, LECM 28471, or the Jordan theropod, and Zuri. After all these analyses, Longrich and Saita found that it was most likely that Nanotyrannus was valid. Longrich and Saita list their reasons thusly, quote, 1. High diversity of tyrannosaurs and predatory dinosaurs supports the idea that multiple tyrannosaurs inhabited the late Maastrichtian of Western North America. 2. Nanotyrannus lacks unique traits that would refer it to Tyrannosaurus, or even the Tyrannosaurinae subfamily, and differs from Tyrannosaurus in over 150 anatomical traits. On top of that, no intermediate forms between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus exist, which should if one is the juvenile of the other. 3. Histology shows specimens of Nanotyrannus with skeletal fusions, mature skull bone textures, slow growth rates relative to T-Rex, decelerating growth in their final years of life, and growth curves predicting adult masses of roughly 1,500 kilograms or less, indicating these animals are subadults or young adults, not juvenile Tyrannosaurus. 4. Growth series of other tyrannosaurids, including Tarbosaurus and Gorgosaurus, don't show the extreme levels of anatomical change proposed for a Nanotyrannus to Tyrannosaurus growth series, and deriving Tyrannosaurus from Nanotyrannus requires several changes inconsistent with known patterns of dinosaur development. 5. Juvenile T-Rex exist, showing diagnostic features of Tyrannosaurus. And 6. Phylogenetic analysis suggests that Nanotyrannus may lie outside Tyrannosauridae, which shouldn't occur if it were a juvenile of T-Rex, even if Tyrannosaur juveniles retain features present in older Tyrannosaurids." End quote. Okay, maybe I paraphrased just a tad there, still gonna throw on some quotation marks there, even though you don't actually see them. Well, unless I want you to, and at this point, I don't think I do. I mean, what do you think? I kind of think that when it comes to quotes, a video editor should either put the quote up for people to read and not read it aloud, or read it aloud but don't put the quote up on screen. I used to like having a funny voice to read quotes, but that kind of works better for historical accounts and such. Anyways, Longrich and Saita found that
The One Piece is real!
but no one really cared because it was published by Longrich. Valid? I don't know, maybe. Not up to me. Thomas Carr did a talk at the 2024 Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference rebutting the Longrich and Saita 2024 paper. Carr said that there should be anatomical differences between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus if Nanotyrannus is a juvenile of Tyrannosaurus. He's right that the mere existence of moderate to even extreme anatomical difference between the two is not an argument for the separation of the two outright. The second point made by Longrich and Saita, that there are no definitive intermediate growth forms between the two tyrants, is just plain wrong. This one is, nuh-uh. Not much to explain there. The third point is that the level of extreme change from Nano to T-Rex is not seen in the growth of other Tyrannosaurs. Carr says nuh-uh and points to the growth series of Albertosaurus, Daspletosaurus, and Tarbosaurus. Okay man, that's cool. I think this was more about the two disagreeing on the same data in specimens. The lack of a really good adult specimen is the major issue here. At the same 2024 SVP meeting, Christopher Griffin and colleagues who had previously done a poster presentation at another SVP meeting about an histologic study on the Zuri specimen from which Longrich and Saita got their data for Zuri, did a poster proving that the Cleveland skull was an adult at death, using histologic samples of the hyoid or tongue bones. They think that Nanotyrannus is valid, but sadly this was never a published paper. Okay. Now we can finally end this traumatic back and forth cycle and get into what Lindsay, Zano, and colleagues cooked up for us in the big 2025. Zano Napoli 2025. With enough of the dueling dinosaurs, Tyrannosaur, nicknamed Bloody Mary, prepared out of the Matrix, the North Carolina Museum's crew were able to observe, measure, and test every anatomical trait preserved in the nearly 100% complete skeleton, and compare it with every other known Nanotyrannus-like Tyrannosaur to finally get to the bottom of what the hell this thing is. Lindsay Zano and James Napoli published their work in Nature almost on Halloween 2025. The study focused on Bloody Mary, now accessioned as NCSM 40,000, as well as other Nanotyrannus specimens and Tyrannosaur specimens. Right out the gate, something that had been talked about for ages was proven very demonstrably true. Nanotyrannus had absolutely and proportionally larger arms than any adult Tyrannosaurus. All other Nanotyrannus specimens were lacking in the arm department. Jane, for example, only had a few isolated hand and arm bones, making the argument between growth changes, individual variation, and evolutionary differences more or less ambiguous. It was thought that juvenile Tyrannosaurs might have had proportionally longer arms that grew slower as they matured, but this doesn't appear to be nearly enough to account for the difference. Numerous other differences were also found. Nanotyrannus had a unique set of hollows in the cheekbone region unknown in other tyrannosaurs, and totally lacked a common blood vessel opening at the tip of the snout called a subnarial foramen. Obliteration, resorption, and remodeling of these bones as part of growth is totally unseen in any other land animal, and seemingly small differences like this are very often a sign of a unique genus or species. There also proved to be far fewer similarities between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus than previously thought. Essentially, almost any time they did resemble each other, those similarities were also found across the entirety of the Tyrannosaur family, and would not align Nanotyrannus with Tyrannosaurus specifically. If Nanotyrannus was genuinely a juvenile of a larger species, then it could have grown up to become any type of Tyrannosaur, not specifically Tyrannosaurus itself. This is contrary to growth cycles seen in both birds and crocodilians. A juvenile Nile crocodile and juvenile saltwater crocodile may not look exactly like their parents, but skeletally they can be distinguished from each other by traits that align them with their respective parents. Insights into the growth of Bloody Mary also made waves in another way. One of the arguments against Nanotyrannus' validity was that there were no adult Nanotyrannus specimens, and all of the individuals found were seemingly still growing at the time of death. Bloody Mary proved to be an adult. A cross-section of its bones showed it had been growing for at least 14 or so years, but hadn't grown much at all for some years after. This individual had multiple layers of arrested growth, showing it was more or less at its adult size. Bloody Mary seemed to be somewhere between the ages of 17 and 22, noticeably older than the Jane specimen's age of between 8 and 15, despite being of slightly smaller size. This meant Bloody Mary was well within the age of known large Tyrannosaurus and absolutely wasn't the same genus. But if Jane was nearly the same size, if not larger than Bloody Mary, why was it younger? That's where the second surprise came in. The pair of egghead scientists took an in-depth look at Bloody Mary and Jane, but also the original Cleveland skull and several other specimens that had distinguishing traits indicating they were all members of the same genus. While they all have traits allying them to the known species Nanotyrannus lancensis, Jane was a freaking weirdo in several respects. Jane was still clearly a part of the same genus, as there were far more similarities between it and the Nanotyrannus lancensis specimens, but there were a few differences in the anatomy. These included a straight neural spine on the axis, several pleural seals or air holes in the axis, multiple air chambers in the tail vertebrae, and an adult size somewhere around 700 kilograms. Jane, meanwhile, had an axis with a crenulate or ridged anterior surface, and only one pleural seal. More solid tail vertebrae, different sinus and foramen shapes in the skull, and was already well over 700 kilograms when it died, with a potential adult mass north of 1,200 kilograms. With this in mind, Jane was erected as the holotype for a brand new species, Nanotyrannus lethaeus. Named for the mythological river where one could forget old memories, lethaeus was chosen as a symbolic gesture of Jane casting off its old identity as a juvenile tyrant king in the making and stepping forward as the first known member of a brand new species. Nanotyrannus lancensis and Nanotyrannus lethaeus both have very similar builds. Leggy and lean, just how I like my man. Whatever. The 2025 study describes them as hypercursorial, which is just a fancy word meaning that they are really good at running, with extremely long legs relative to their body size to give them an impressive stride without too much weight slowing them down. Prior studies on some of the specimens back when they were identified as juvenile Tyrannosaurus indicated that Nanotyrannus were potentially amongst the fastest of all predatory theropods, with speeds somewhere between 31 to 52 kilometers per hour. This estimate was even made without accounting for some of the effects of extra muscle mass that might have increased their pace. The genus also has noticeably larger arms than any other Western Tyrannosaur, with hands bearing 2 functional fingers that each bore very large claws that were hooked and recurved for grasping and slashing. They never skipped arm day. Uniquely, the genus also has a vestigial third finger that can be seen in the skeleton, but would have been invisible within the hand in life. I personally think they used it to make credible business agreements. Let me bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's The Most Extreme to show you what you're up against. Size-wise, Nanotyrannus lancensis was the smaller of the two. You're dealing with something roughly estimated at around 5 to 7 meters, 16 to 23 feet long, 1.7 meters, 5.5 feet tall, and 500 to 700 kilograms, based on measurements from Bloody Mary's femur. These estimates will be refined by upcoming volumetric analysis, so stay tuned for that. The other species, Nanotyrannus lethaeus, was somewhat larger. The only known specimen, Jane, was still growing at the time of death. Jane is estimated around 7 to 8 meters, 23 to 26 feet long, 2 meters, 6.5 feet tall, and 800 kilograms. And it's considered plausible that a hypothetical fully grown adult individual might have been somewhere north of 1,200 kilograms. Still small for a tyrannosaur, but noticeably larger than the original holotype. Coincidentally, Nanotyrannus lethaeus adult size estimate is extremely similar to estimates for the eastern tyrannosaur Dryptosaurus. Remember this for later. Alright, thanks Mr. Man. Get on out of here! While the number of known juvenile Tyrannosaur specimens has now noticeably dwindled, especially those that are available for public research and not in private collections, there are still a few known youthful tyrant kings out there open for study. Specimens LACM 23845 or Dinotyrannus and TCM 2001.90.1 or Bucky are still recognizable as young Tyrannosaurus rex. The former is only somewhat larger than most Nanotyrannus specimens, while Bucky is noticeably larger despite most adult T-Rex specimens still dwarfing it. Phil Curry and colleagues' 2004 Nature study describing evolutionary changes among tyrannosauroids indicated both of these specimens were in their middle teens, with LACM 23845 roughly 14 years old, and the Bucky specimen a few years older. Despite the incomplete nature of these specimens, they still preserved distinguishing hallmarks of the heavily built Tyrannosaurine part of the Tyrannosaur family tree, such as reduced arms, robust jaws, and stout teeth. This means that even by their 15th year or so, Tyrannosaurus already had a robust frame compared to their Nanotyrannus kin, and would have rapidly outsized them within that time frame. Me and my big buff wife. Older reconstructions of known young T-Rex used specimens now known to be Nanotyrannus, so the idea that young T-Rex were extremely leggy lean speed machines might need some reevaluation. They certainly were lighter built than their parents, but perhaps not by as much as previously thought. So if Nanotyrannus wasn't part of the Tyrannosaurinae and wasn't close to Tyrannosaurus, then what was it? As far back as the holotype's original description, other ideas were tested to find out what kin Tyrannosaurus had. The Cleveland skull was briefly labeled as a species of Gorgosaurus, and at a glance this comparison does make some sense. Albertosaurines were a group of tyrannosaurs that were quite common in the Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, immediately before the very last epoch, the Maastrichtian, which includes the Lance and Hell Creek formations. This could have just been their end from environmental pressures. It could be that more formations need to be sampled from later times, or it could be that big buff mean old Tyrannosaurus came into the continent and stole the lunch money from these lighter, leaner athletes. The Albertosaurs have relatively gracile bodies and, like the Cleveland skull, sport skinnier snouts compared to Tyrannosaurines. The comparison to the Albertosaurs also aligns with ecology. Most late Cretaceous geologic formations preserve a heavy Tyrannosaur and a light Albertosaur. For example, Gorgosaurus and Daspletosaurus lived at the same time and place in the Dinosaur Park Formation of Canada. This also occurred in Asia with the Nemegt formations Tarbosaurus and Alioramus. So maybe the two body types really can live together. No body shaming, guys. Prior research indicates Tyrannosaurus was more closely related to Asiatic tyrannosaurines, like Tarbosaurus and Shusheng-Tyrannus, than it was to native North American forms from the Campanian epoch. This implies a migration event occurred with Tyrannosaurus or its immediate forerunner, moving into Laramidia from Asia. They didn't care about borders back then. God, take me back. While they did take the top predator roles, some experts speculate that the native Albertosaurines might have survived by downsizing and adapting to a Mesopredator role, eventually resulting in forms like Nanotyrannus. They got squashed into little man syndrome. An alternative hypothesis posits, assuming Nanotyrannus is valid, that its name might be coincidentally very fitting. Size is one of the most plastic traits of a species. If conditions are right for speciation, rapid changes in size can occur. The cougar, puma, or mountain lion is currently a top-order carnivore across most of North America. It's one of the largest hypercarnivores across most of the United States and Canada. However, the cougar has been endemic since the Pleistocene, where several species of felid outsized it, like jaguars, American lions, Smilodon, and Homotherium. Ironically, the Ice Age cougar was noticeably smaller than the modern form, suggesting the recent uptick in their size was a direct response to changing conditions and extinction of competition. An inverse of this relationship is also possible. So, some researchers proposed that Nanotyrannus might have been part of the same Asiatic Tyrannosaurine migration, but split from Tyrannosaurus, rapidly shrunk, and diverged. Turns out, Zano and Napoli's work discovered several largely unexpected scenarios. Now, let me emphasize that the authors themselves have cautioned against using any of their preliminary phylogenetic data for ironclad classification. However, for the sake of argument, I'll go over some of the scenarios considered most likely because the results were genuinely surprising. Nanotyrannus exhibited numerous traits not seen in any other late Cretaceous tyrannosaurids, neither in North America nor Asia. There doesn't yet seem to be any direct ancestors in those regions, meaning either they haven't been discovered yet or that said ancestor wasn't from those regions. If not the West, then what better place to look for a beast than the East?
Oh, East? I thought you said West.
The 2025 research had 8 phylogenetic tree analysis results. Some found Nanotyrannus' closest kin included some of the most primitive and poorly understood tyrannosaurs, such as Moros, which some viewers may recognize from its shrunken baby form appearing in Jurassic World Dominion, the highly unusual eastern Appalachiosaurus, and the very first predatory dinosaur identified in North America, Dryptosaurus. Guess the 1988 authors who described the Cleveland skull were closer to a slam dunk than they even thought. Nanotyrannus' exact placement in this group is still uncertain. One tree analysis found it closest to the 90+ million-year-old Moros. This result was a little weird because it plopped Nanotyrannus lethaeus closer to Moros than Nanotyrannus lancensis, which would obviously force one out of the species or genus name. 1. Figure 9a put all the Nanotyrannus specimens together as a group that split from the Tyrannosaurid tree before it split into the Albertosaurinae and Tyrannosaurinae. The authors have come up with the name Nanotyrannidae for this grouping. However, if it also includes things like Dryptosaurus, then the name would have to be Dryptosauridae. Like this result, figure 9b, which found the exact same thing as the last one I showed you, but has Dryptosaurus as the first one to diverge from the group, which then split into the 3 other groups. This one also has Moros as a nanotyrannid/Dryptosaurid closest to Pete the Nanotyrannus. This other one, figure 90, has Dryptosaurus as the earliest one, and equally as closely related to a bunch of other tyrannosauroids that did not place close to Nanotyrannus: Suskityrannus of New Mexico, Xiangguanlong of China, Timerlangia of Uzbekistan, Electrosaurus of Mongolia, and Konglu of Mongolia. This result has Appalachiosaurus as the one right outside of the grouping of Tyrannosaurinae, Albertosaurinae, and the Nanotyrannidae. Next up is this result, figure 10a, which has the Nanotyrannidae as its own thing, and the earliest diverging, with the other branch going off into Moros, and then the Tyrannosaurinae and Albertosaurinae. The last one here, figure 10d, has all of the Nanotyrannus specimens plus Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus together as part of what should be a Dryptosauridae that diverged from the Tyrannosaurinae/Albertosaurinae group, which would be the true Tyrannosauridae, I think. Lots of people have jumped on the tree that has Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus as the closest relatives of the Nanotyrannus group. Dryptosaurus is most well known from a Charles Knight painting called Leaping Laelaps, which was the original name for the dinosaur before it was found to be occupied by a measly little mite. Despite its distressingly scrappy material, many experts have tentatively reconstructed the animal with relatively large arms and claws and a narrow snout. These traits are suspiciously similar to Bloody Mary, which did not go unnoticed when preliminary photos of Bloody Mary were disseminated online between 2006 and 2011. It just so happens that Dryptosaurus and Nanotyrannus were around at the same time too. The region Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus called home was the reason for the latter's name. For most of the late Cretaceous, North America was divided straight down the middle by a shallow inland sea, aptly named the Western Interior Seaway. The continent to the left is called Laramidia, and the one to the right is Appalachia. The rock records don't seem to preserve much evidence of a land bridge connecting the two halves until that slaggy little seaway began to regress back to where it belonged, away from the land. This did explain why the terrestrial fauna didn't seem to have much overlap, with only amphibious species like crocodilians or flighted species like pterosaurs and birds on both sides. However, researchers Jason Lilligraben and Lawrence Ostresch published research in the Geological Society of America in 1990, finding the Western Interior Seaway began receding around 86 million years ago and shrank considerably by the end of the Cretaceous. These results aren't definitive as to whether or not this would have been enough to allow for some permanent or temporary land bridges, with the only known definitive crossings after the Cretaceous in the Paleocene. Nanotyrannus, as either a close relative of or descendant of creatures like Dryptosaurus, would be some of the earliest evidence that non-avian dinosaurs were able to cross the seaway. Whether it was land bridges or island hopping or the ocean receding enough that swimming would have been possible under the right conditions remains to be seen. Both Zano and Napoli have cautioned against jumping on this result, as it is preliminary, and only one of the 8 results found Dryptosaurus to be even remotely closely related to Nanotyrannus. They are still currently working on publishing more about the specimen and potentially others, so this could all be a false positive or convergent evolution. Don't run with this one possibility among many. Did you know that I have a Patreon? You can subscribe for $1, with some benefits including early access to videos, insight into my workflow, and early looks at future projects. I mean, if every one of you just donated like $1, I'd be able to make like studio level videos, you know what I'm saying? Just $1 gets you access to early access videos, your name in the credits and the description, and early looks at work in progress videos. So make sure you go check out patreon.com/edgescience. On with the show. Part 4. You really ought to leave. The Forgotten Outliers. The most important and now publicly available specimens of Nanotyrannus are well known, with most now getting full scientific descriptions. Though I wouldn't doubt a full monographic treatment of Jane to be published someday, maybe even by or with the help of the North Carolina gang. That said, there are now well over a handful of known immature Tyrannosaur specimens from the Lance and Hell Creek formations. Most are privately owned, and therefore are scientifically useless until they become publicly available, a la the Montana Dueling Dinos. That said, they are so tantalizing that I found myself remiss not to list them out, tell you how complete they are, and show how they might be helpful for the understanding of Tyrannosaurus and Nanotyrannus. Those that are publicly available tend to suck though, consisting of singular pieces or a handful of unhelpful mush. But with all this preemptive mumbo-jumbo out of the way, let's begin. Let's see where the next stage in the Nano v Rex debate might take us. 1966 Jordan Theropod, LACM 28471. In the summer of 1966, LA paleontologist Harley Garbani was out on FS McKeever Ranch land in the Badlands of Garfield County, Montana, near the town of Jordan, when he stumbled upon the badly preserved remains of a theropod noggin eroding out of a dark gray clay chunk of the Hell Creek Formation. Once it was taken back to the LA County Museum, it would remain in the collections for over a decade before paleontologist Ralph Molnar got around to describing it. He found the specimen, which includes both maxillae or upper jaws, teeth, nasals, frontals, parietal, and portions of the syringular and lower jaws, to be too fragmentary to apply to a known or new genus and species. He simply called it the Jordan theropod. Garbani and some people from the LA Museum thought the specimen was from a juvenile Tyrannosaurus before Molnar got around to describing it, so this is technically the first of such specimens to ever be attributed to an actual juvenile Tyrannosaurus. The Cleveland skull was found and described before this, obviously, but it was considered a new species of Albertosaurus. Molnar didn't think it was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, and it has now been one of the handful of specimens of anomalous Hell Creek giant theropods embroiled in the Nano-V-Rex debate. These simple remains went through a bit of a taxonomic back and forth in the decades after its first publication, no doubt because there were basically no other nano or juvenile Rex specimens to work with. Gregory S. Paul took another look at it in the late 1980s, describing it as a new species of the very old genus Oblisodon, which had enjoyed renewed interest in the 80s and 90s, but had been originally created in the 1860s. He named it Oblisodon molnaris, and then Oblisodon molnari, and was then reassigned to an already existing species, Oblisodon mirandus, by Molnar and Kenneth Carpenter in 1989, before being uplifted to a unique genus by George Olszewski in 1995, Stygivenator molnari, meaning Molnar's river Styx hunter, which is pretty badass all things considered. This scrappy critter would be subsumed by Tyrannosaurus and exhumed out of the Tyrannosaurus genus and validated with its unique label over and over again until the 2025 Zano Napoli paper. In the new research, they find that the anatomical traits preserved in the specimen are just too poor to actually definitively identify the specimen. They consider it a dubious theropod dinosaur, but didn't think there was enough evidence to consider it either Tyrannosaurus or Nanotyrannus. Additionally, they say that the 2024 work of Longrich and Saita, in which they considered the genus valid and different from Nanotyrannus in a list of traits they considered accurate, was wrong. Zano and Napoli argued that the issue was that they were basing the connection of Stygivenator and Nanotyrannus on the Jane specimen, which turned out to also be unique to other Nanotyrannus specimens, with Zano and Napoli naming it as a new species, Nanotyrannus lethaeus. 1997. Tinker. All the way back in 1997, commercial fossil hunter, excavator, and preparator Mark Eatman was out scoring some land in South Dakota for anything that could catch a good price. On this particular jaunt, he stumbled upon the remains of a medium-sized tyrannosaur that was quite exciting. The specimen, which alternatively goes by the name Tinker or Rocky, includes the premaxillae and maxillae bones, a partial nasal, the jugal, parietal, squamosal, both quadratojugals, a quadrate, palatine, pterygoid, a dentary or lower jaw, the splenial, coronoids, syringular, angular, prearticular, articulars, some teeth, 2 cervical ribs, 5 dorsal ribs, rib fragments, 20 partial tail vertebrae, 12 chevrons, partial scapulae and coracoids, or shoulder girdles, humeri, hand claws, incomplete ilia, pubes, and the ischium of the pelvis, a tibia, and a toe claw. The thing has been estimated to be around 30 feet in length, which is about 2/3 the size of an adult. This means this specimen may be the most complete and only definitive specimen of an older juvenile or young subadult ever found. It exhibits anatomy unlike that of any purported Nanotyrannus specimen and looks a heck of a lot more like an adult Tyrannosaurus. Unfortunately for the future of the Nano-V-Rex debate, this specimen is locked in a never-ending legal battle, and when it isn't, it keeps changing hands too. To make a very long story short, the legal rights to the fossil on the land was in question. The land on which Eatman found his specimen belonged to either some rancher named Gary Gilbert, or that land had been leased to Gilbert from the county. Eatman sold the excavation rights to the specimen to Ron Frithiof, a noted fossil hunter who reportedly only got into the field to make boatloads of cash after the auction of Sioux. Frithiof got a lease from the county for the fossils, with the county getting a 10% cut of the sale of said specimen. Frithioth's first target was the Indianapolis Children's Museum and tapped a price tag on Tinker of 8.5 million bones. The county wanted that chunk of change, so they started some legal BS with Frithioth, which eventually ended with Frithioth getting the specimen in 2009. However, Frithioth outsourced the job of preparation to someone else who happened to file for bankruptcy as the legal battle ended, so Tinker ended up in the possession of a federal bankruptcy court. The story after this period is a little murky. Someone fabricated a fossil and resin mount of the bones and then made molds of that mount to make and sell casts of the skeleton, while the real bones worked their way through whatever legal steps they needed to. This skeleton was very poorly reconstructed. As you can see, the skull doesn't look right. Regardless, casts of this thing have been sold to a bunch of places, like the Journey Museum in Rapid City and the Discovery Center of Idaho. The weird part is that at some point between 2009 and 2018, it was bought either by or for the Ultimatel Dinosaur Museum in Denkendorf, Germany. An article by Süddeutsche Zeitung seems to imply they had a hand in this, as they displayed the dinosaur in their headquarters. It's not really a big secret or anything, I just can't find a lot of direct information about it. At some point during the purchase, a new group of fossil preparators and fabricators were brought on to basically reconstruct the specimen, and they did one hell of a better job, with the bones now fitting together more accurately and with less cartoonish proportions. It was put on display at the museum and renamed Rocky. Sadly, seemingly no research has or is being done on this specimen. The museum seems like a privately run, for-profit type, so this may be one reason, though that hasn't stopped the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Research Center in the US before. So hopefully someday we get to actually see a publication on this holy grail of a skeleton. 2001 SWAU HRS, Zuri. In 2001, Zuri Franco discovered the remains of a Tyrannosaur somewhere in the middle of nowhere, eastern Wyoming. The details are quite fuzzy, as the specimen belongs to the Dinosaur Museum at the Southwestern Adventist University, an extremely religious, young Earth creationist university. Despite what I just said, you wouldn't know it from a brief glance. They hide that particular side of them pretty well. But you can read between the lines if you've seen enough apologetics from that particular loony bin. Since I would rather dive deeper on this fossil in its own video, I will keep it brief. What they have is enough of the skull to basically create a full reconstruction. The only thing it's missing is the back of the head, the tip of the snout, and some of the main chunks from the back of the jaw. Longrich Saita's 2024 Nanotyrannus paper identified Zuri as a Nanotyrannus, though a thorough study of Zuri to prove this is likely not possible. Otherwise, it would have been done by now or included in the Zano Napoli 2025 study. 2003 LACM 7509/150167, Thomas. Between 2003 and 2005, the LA County Museum were excavating a site in southeastern Montana because they had another Tyrannosaur on their hands. The specimen is around 70% complete and has been estimated to be around 10 meters long and 17 years of age. LACM 7509, or Thomas, is on display at the LA Museum and is similar in size and age to Tinker. Interestingly, it does not seem to be included in the Zano Napoli paper, so perhaps it will be included in analyses to get to the bottom of what an actual juvenile or subadult Tyrannosaurus looks like. Thomas exhibits a far more robust morphology than any Nanotyrannus specimen, and is only about 10 feet longer than Jane. 2006 Little Clint. All the way back in 2006, Thomas Carr and company found a dig site in southeastern Montana that contained just a few teeny bones that they think belong to a baby Tyrannosaurus much younger than any Nanotyrannus specimen. It's a frontal, a rib, and a toe bone. So yeah, not substantial, and not very conclusive, but still neat that it exists, right? 2013 Baby Bob. One of the more upsetting discoveries was Baby Bob, a small Tyrannosaur discovered near Jordan, Montana in 2013 by fossil hunter Bob Dietrich. Bob and his brother Alan took all the fossils back to their setup to prepare and find a buyer. The weird part is that they loaned it to the museum at the University of Kansas for display and study, where it stayed for 2 years. Seemingly no work on Baby Bob was able to be completed because after 2 years, Dietrich reportedly said or thought, quote, "I did my fair share of giving," end quote. Which, I mean, that's pretty ruthless if you ask me. So he listed the thing on eBay for $2.95 million and listed the museum as involved with the sale. The museum does not sell fossils and forced Dietrich to leave their name out of it, and poor Baby Bob was taken off exhibit and sent back to Dietrich. The eBay sale never went through, and the specimen remains with Dietrich to this day, though there are rumors it may have an owner. The specimen is small and young enough that, if not a Nanotyrannus, it could be one of the best true juvenile Tyrannosaurs. It's been estimated to be around 4 years old based on its size, but videos as recent as 2019 and 2020 show a cast reconstruction of the skull of the specimen still in possession of Dietrich. It's also not entirely clear how complete the specimen is, since there hasn't been any study of it. Much of the specimen seems to be skull pieces based on the photos of the real material. There are some limb bones as well. Alas, it is lost to science until it gets entered into a public institution. 2016, KUVP 156375. All the way back in 2016, David Burnham of the University of Kansas, as well as a huge team of volunteers from the university and its museum, discovered the remains of a small tyrannosaur in the Hell Creek Formation of Garfield County, Montana. The specimen, KUVP 156357, includes both maxillae, or upper jaws, with a lot of its teeth still in their sockets, plus a partial premaxilla, jugal, postorbital, vomer, and ectopterygoid, a neck and a back vertebra, some ribs, chevrons, and metatarsals 1, 4, and 5, and some toe bones and claws. Not great, but better than a single bone, and about as good as some of the other privately held specimens. This specimen is still being recovered and prepared, with the 2024 field season the last one needed to complete the excavation, so I would expect the specimen to appear in more literature within the next few years. Burnham and colleagues already published a preliminary report on the specimen back in 2018, so expect more on this one. 2019, Jody/Chomper. If you thought the Montana Dueling Dinosaurs were the only thing that rancher/dino hunter Clayton Phipps was uncovering and selling off to whomever, then you'd be wrong. In 2019, Phipps and his team found another small tyrannosaur in Montana. This one is reportedly around 55% complete, with a 90% complete skull and is similar in size and anatomy to Jane, which we now know belongs to a species of the Nanotyrannus genus. The discovery and excavation of this specimen, which goes interchangeably by Jody or Chomper, was documented on the Discovery Channel show Dino Hunters. I happened to do a sort of PSA-ish video about the Dino Hunters show a long time ago. I don't exactly hold the same strong views today as I did then, but the fact that these things still largely end up being sold to whomever, and considering how some of them actually are incredibly scientifically important, I still believe that allowing billionaires to take more from us is probably not a good thing. Based on images of the mounted skeleton, it looks to be just a little larger than Jane, which would line up with what Zano and Napoli estimated for a more mature Nanotyrannus lethaeus. 2009 to 2010, BHI 6439, Nicholas. Sometime between 2009 and 2010, Dr. Stephen Nicholas and a team from the Mid-American Paleontological Society were out in Montana doing some digging when they discovered another medium-sized tyrannosaur. Little is known of this specimen because it was sold to fossil collector Terry Boudreau as Dr. Nicholas was low on funds. That said, it seems as though it was likely prepared by the Black Hills Institute, as they made molds of the fossils and have casts of this specimen in their possession. The current whereabouts of the actual fossils is unknown. Casper. Not many specifics are known about this specimen. It's the skull and possible postcrania of a possibly 6 to 7 year old tyrannosaur. It gets its name because it was found near Casper, Wyoming. It was prepared, reconstructed, and sold to a Danish collector. The skull was temporarily loaned to the Natural History Museum of Denmark to go along with Tristan Otto. While at the museum, researchers CT scanned the specimen, figuring out how much was real and how much was reconstructed. Turns out a lot of it was real, about 60%. An article about the scanning says it was worked on by a Canadian company, and that could be anyone, but I wouldn't doubt it was either Research Casting International or Dino Lab Inc. This one may be entirely lost to science, as it's definitively owned by some random elite. Maybe they will donate it at the time of death. More 6625, Chomper. Next up, we have another specimen named Chomper. We can thank the land before time for confusing nicknames. The specimen is very fragmentary, consisting of just some skull pieces. It was found by Lee Hall with the Museum of the Rockies, where it resides as specimen MOR 6625. Hopefully this specimen gets a full proper description someday. 2022, DM&S, Teen Rex. In the summer of 2022, 8-year-old Liam, 11-year-old Jessen, and their 10-year-old cousin Caden were wandering around the Badlands of Marmarth, North Dakota looking for fossils when they stumbled upon some large, shiny brown bones eroding out of a rocky outcrop on some BLM land. The kids sent photos of their find to Denver Museum paleontologist and famed dino mummy finder Tyler Leeson, who confirmed what the kids had found was a dinosaur. Once Leeson got out there to Marmarth, serendipitously his hometown, he was able to confirm that what was found was a medium-sized dinosaur with some good portions of its body preserved. Excavation time. Over the course of 11 days, Leeson, the kids, and a crew from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science excavated, field prepared, jacketed, and removed the specimen. According to the press kit materials for this discovery, the Teen Rex excavation was a meticulous process. The overlying rock, or overburden, was first removed using a 70-pound jackhammer and picks and shovels. The crew then carefully excavated around the bones using specialized tools and techniques to ensure the fossil was not damaged. Once the fossil was field prepared, they reinforced it with wooden bracers and jacketed it before getting a helicopter to take it out to a trailer and take it back to the museum. It was only when the crew were actually chipping rock away from the fossils that they were able to give a tentative identification to it, a juvenile Tyrannosaurus. That made the find extra special. There are only about a handful of juvenile Tyrannosaurs in publicly available institutions, where they can be studied and restudied. It's still under analysis, but most of it has been fully prepared at this point. The entirety of what was preserved of the skull has been revealed. The rest of it will have to be observed with CT scans. They found the pelvis, a leg, and the skull. However, they found that they had collected more of its skull than initially thought when in the field, so I wouldn't be surprised if more of the skeleton was found as well. Plus, the Denver Museum crew keeps going out to the same area each summer, so they will likely keep finding more stuff. I can't wait for the publication on this specimen. It looks a lot more like an adult Tyrannosaurus than a Nanotyrannus, despite being similar in size to Bloody Mary and Jane. The never-ending saga of Nanotyrannus versus Tyrannosaurus is extensive and annoying, a perfect exemplar of the scientific method in action. From an endangered keystone find to ethical questions on research and discourse, and a library's worth of half-century-old papers, the discussion and debate on this animal will always spark interest. As an episode of Paleo World once put it, undoubtedly, the paleontologist of tomorrow will enjoy a few laughs at our expense. One thing that Zano Napoli 2025 paper didn't discuss is the skin impressions. Bloody Mary reportedly has some amount of skin impressions on the legs, and maybe even preservation of internal organs. Here's an image of some of the skin from the foot. It may prove something interesting about the integument of these dinosaurs. New research will update the old, and what was unveiled in 2025 might just be the start to a brand new chapter in the understanding of both the tyrant lizard king and its tiny tyrant neighbors. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.